What's up guys, my name is Ace, and recently within the Battlefield community there has been an idea that's been spreading that's designed to improve gunplay and weapon balancing to some degree, and this has even been acknowledged by developers at this point. And this idea is introducing separate limb multipliers for at least many of the weapons in the game. Not all of them need to have this, but essentially if you're shooting them in the limb rather than the torso, you would deal less damage, and therefore sometimes it would take you extra shots to kill for not being precise enough to hit the torso. Now, since this has been spreading, I've had a lot of people coming to me wanting to know my thoughts on this, and so that's what we're going to be doing today. And just to be upfront here, I'm not a huge fan of this idea. Now, I'd be open to the idea of testing it out, maybe in Battlefield Labs, for instance, to see how things go, but I'm not convinced this would be the right call, or at least the best adjustment to try first over some other potential adjustments that they could be making that I think would be a lot safer than this one. Now, before we get into exactly why, I just wanted to point out where the developers have acknowledged this idea, at least. When asked about this, David Sirlin basically just said, we'll talk about that in testing too, regarding the limb multiplier. So they've confirmed it's something they'll discuss, but there's no confirmation at this point, at least, that they're actually going to be doing anything about that. So back to my thoughts on adding limb multipliers. Let's first talk about the pros of this and why it could perhaps be a good idea. Maybe I'm wrong on this, maybe this actually works out. Well, the primary motivating factor behind this would be to effectively increase the experience time to kill in the game, because for many, they feel the time to kill is just too fast in Battlefield 6, especially with certain guns in the game. And so by adding a lower limb multiplier to those problem guns that kill too fast, you at least create a chance of them killing slower in the same situation if that player isn't accurate enough, if they're not precise enough to land those torso shots. Additionally, by doing this, it gives them just another lever to work with to tune individual guns and give them more character. And that's actually an area that I think is desperately needed in Battlefield 6. I think there's a lot of room for improvement when it comes to more clearly differentiating guns within a class so that they really feel more unique than they currently do. And so with this, they could make it so some of the weaker guns that kill a bit slower by default right now, they could maintain the ability to have the same amount of damage to the limbs versus the body. Whereas for some of the more powerful guns that we've currently got, that's where you introduce that limb multiplier. So they still maintain the same power potential if you're accurate, but if you're not accurate, then the gun is going to be weaker in your hands than it was before introducing these limb multipliers. By doing that, your choice now becomes more interesting between those two guns, because as of now, if you're confident enough that you're going to be hitting your shots with either of those guns, then the clear choice is to just go with the faster killing gun. Once you introduce those limb multipliers, now the choice is, do I want consistency, where it's going to have a bit of a slower potential, but it's going to be at least very consistent with that time to kill, or do I want to go for the other option that has more killing potential, but I'm not always going to see that potential if I'm not really on point with my shots hitting specific body multipliers. So this would absolutely allow them to introduce a lot more character to the weapons. And then finally, on my list of pros here, this would, at least in theory, provide an additional layer of skill expression to the game, because for those that are confident that they can very consistently hit those torso shots without mixing in limb shots anywhere, they're going to be rewarded more heavily than those that aren't able to do that on a consistent basis. So this would increase the aiming skill gap, at least to some degree, in the game. And so far, you're probably thinking this all sounds like a good idea, because on paper at least, there are some clear pros here. And this is why I don't want to write this idea off entirely. I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm not saying it definitely wouldn't work. I just think there are some potential issues that need to be considered here. And I personally feel these issues do outweigh the potential benefits of this system. The first key issue with this is adding these limb multipliers could lead to a feeling of inconsistency in fights with a gun, where sometimes your gun takes 4 shots, for instance, within a given damage range, and other times it takes 5. And it just feels odd not having that muscle memory, knowing exactly when your gun is going to kill. And this is actually something we've experienced in Call of Duty. Several Call of Duty games have done separate limb multipliers for like regular full auto guns. And while it wasn't a deal breaker by any means, this feeling of inconsistency absolutely popped up, and it was a frustration for many out there, because oftentimes it didn't really feel like you had full control over where your shots were actually landing on target when you introduce all of the variables that are present. And very importantly in Call of Duty, that game doesn't have aim down sight spread, unlike Battlefield. And in most multiplayer like 6v6 engagements in Call of Duty, it's literally hit scan. So there's no bullet travel time getting into the way of that either. You're actually dealing with hit scan situations. And yet there was still that feeling of random inconsistency in certain gunfights. So I fear this feeling of inconsistency would be heavily exacerbated in Battlefield 6 because of their pure bullet velocity system, but more importantly, their aim down sight spread system. With this, obviously at close ranges, this probably wouldn't be much of an issue, but as you get to those mid to long ranges, that aim down sight spread would now become a big factor on whether or not a particular shot that's aimed at the torso is going to be hitting the torso or hitting the arm. And while yes, you can control your spread to a degree by tap firing and crouching in the situation, for instance, and making sure you're planting your feet, realistically, looking at those mid to long range fights, you're still not eliminating the spread entirely. There still is going to be that element of randomness mixed into that situation, and therefore, there will be situations where you have flawless aim, you're doing the right things to control your spread, and yet you're still experiencing enough of that spread, combined with the bullet travel time as well, to be hitting those limb multiplier zones and therefore taking an extra shot to kill. And in those situations, the number of hits required to get a kill on that player wouldn't really be fully in your control because of this random inconsistency that you only have so much control over. And none of this so far is even taking into account the current level of hit registration in general in Battlefield 6. As of right now, it's often inconsistent enough as to whether or not you'll even hit the body in general, let alone specific multipliers within the body when shooting on target. You can already be aiming perfectly on target, controlling your spread appropriately, leading the target appropriately if necessary in that situation, and getting a hit client side, but the server rejects that hit anyway. Just imagine that, but layer in even smaller body multiplier zones that need to be factored into the equation there. And I don't think it's a stretch at all to assume that there will be many situations where client side on your end, you do everything perfectly to make sure you're hitting that bonus, that torso multiplier zone, and yet the server would decide, actually, that was a limb shot, so we're going to need you to hit him one more time compared to if that weren't a limb shot. If I had to guess, that would be happening on a very consistent basis, just based on the community's current experience with hit registration in general, and its inability to often decide if you even hit the target in the first place. Now, obviously, hit registration is a separate issue, and we have hopes that that's going to be improving over time. And in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to make gameplay balancing decisions based on how good or bad the hit registration is in the game. But in reality, it does need to be factored into decisions like this, because at the end of the day, what matters is what the players actually experience in live online matches. So I suspect that, combined with the aim down sight spread issue, would largely invalidate the potential benefits of introducing limb multipliers in the first place. I think it would just end up introducing more inconsistency and frustration than we already experience. And then one last thing I wanted to tag on to the potential issues here. This is more of a minor thing, but I do think this could change player behavior as well to adapt to this system. By introducing limb multipliers, it would now be in your best interest to implement movement into fights even more than currently, because you're trying to throw the enemy off to make sure that they're not hitting that torso zone. And therefore, I think this could encourage more of that movement-based skill gap in gunfights, and that's something that doesn't really fit with Battlefield. It's something Battlefield players are already pushing back against quite heavily with this game. For many, it's become too much like Call of Duty already, and I think this would push it even further in that direction. So it could have some negative side effects there when it comes to player behavior as well. So there we go. That wraps it up for my thoughts and concerns with a system like this. Again, I'd be open to trying it out. I may be totally off on this. Maybe it ends up feeling great. Maybe it actually does feel a whole lot more skill-based, and it provides that additional weapon character. However, I still think there are plenty of other things they can do with their weapon balancing to achieve many of the same benefits that we're looking at here with this limb multiplier system, and yet it wouldn't come with the issues of inconsistency that I outlined. The first big one here is play around with individual damage range profiles for each gun. As it is right now, most of the weapons within a weapon category have the exact same damage range drop-off points. And that's just leaving so much room for balance and customization and weapon character on the table. I think it would be far safer and also far more consistent if they took some of those guns that are killing way too fast and maintain their power potential but reduce the damage range on that, while potentially increasing the damage range on some of the weaker guns. So those faster killing guns will still have their place in the game. You just have to be more careful with how you're approaching your damage ranges relative to the weaker guns or the slower killing guns that would maintain their power and time to kill potential across longer range windows, making them at least a little more versatile And this comes with those same benefits I talked about with the limb multipliers earlier. You would effectively increase the experience time to kill in many situations at least because of that reduced range value. So if people find themselves outside of the appropriate range for their very fast killing gun, well, now it's going to take them that extra shot to kill. Whereas for the weaker guns, now they're just going to be more consistent. And again, that just creates more interesting choices when deciding which gun you want to use. Do you want to use the one that has better potential, but in more limited situations, or the one that's got worse potential, but more consistency across wider ranges? And the nice thing about this solution is it doesn't introduce all of the inconsistency that you would potentially see with adding limb multipliers, since damage ranges are a lot more clear-cut and easier for a player to control. And honestly, I think that's the primary area that could have the biggest effect, is those damage range drop-off points. However, there are also many other areas with how they handle their weapon balance that's a very similar story, where every single gun from a category of weapon just has the exact same hip fire spread, for instance, or headshot multiplier, or aim down sight movement speed, for instance. All of these areas could be utilized to create more interesting balance between the weapons in a category, make certain guns stand out in some areas more so than others, and bring a little more balance into the equation as well. And that's not to mention, I feel that would make attachment selection per gun a little more interesting as well, because as of right now, you could honestly take one attachment setup from a gun in a class, and if it's really good with one weapon in that class, it's probably going to be a really good attachment selection for every other weapon in that class, and that can get quite boring because so many of the stats just overlap with their weapons within a particular category. So there we go. Those are my thoughts on this situation. I absolutely think there's so much room for improvement when it comes to how they're handling their weapons and their weapon balance, but I don't think introducing limb multipliers is the best solution, or at least not the most obvious solution to start off with when it comes to tuning this weapon balancing. These are just my thoughts on this whole situation, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about this in those comments down below. First off, what are your thoughts on the idea of introducing those limb multipliers, at least for some of the more powerful guns in the game, to take some of that power or consistency away from them? And second, what do you think about the idea of them differentiating guns more in general within each weapon category, with things like damage range or hip fire or headshot multipliers, for instance? Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.